Dear viewers, I would like to warmly welcome you to the living room of the Thomas Mann House. I'm very much excited for today's discussion on the dimensions and potentials of public interest design, a topic that the current Thomas Mann Fellows, the architect and author Doris Kleilein, and architecture journalist Friederike Meyer are working on. Friederike Meyer will engage in a conversation with Sergio Palleroni, professor and director of the Center for Public Interest Design in the School of Architecture at Portland State University. The work of city planners and architects worldwide has come under pressure. A lack of affordable housing, climate change, and migrant movement challenged the traditional image of the role of architects in cities in the United States and Germany. The term public interest design expands the practice of architecture and design towards a multidimensional process that addresses issues such as disaster preparedness and recovery, scarcity of food and water, as well as shelter. During her fellowship at the Thomas Mann House, Friederike Meyer explores how planning structures and strategies can support new forms of living together in changing heterogeneous societies. Together with Sergio Palleroni, she will discuss how architects and planners can re-engage with society to meet the needs of increasingly diverse communities, and how public interest design can create a healthy, resilient, and sustainable living environment. Let me just briefly introduce our guests today. Friederike Meyer is an architecture journalist exploring the intersection of architecture, urban planning, and society. She has been working as editor for architecture journals and is currently leading the newsroom of the architecture platform Baunetz. Together with architect and author Doris Kleilein, she recently published the books Die Stadt nach Corona and Post-Pandemic Urbanism. Sergio Palleroni is professor at and director of the Center for Public Interest Design in the School of Architecture at Portland State. He is the co-founder of the Homelessness Research and Action Collaborative, and his work focuses on methods of integrating sustainable practices to improve the lives of underserved communities worldwide. I would like to thank my colleagues Emilienne Leko and Julia Welter for their help with preparing and hosting this event, as well as Boris Scharschmidt and Hussein Najam for filming and producing this video. Thanks to the Robert Bosch Stiftung for supporting Doris and Friederike's fellowships and today's event. Dear viewers, I hope you enjoyed the program. Thank you very much for tuning in today.
Hello and welcome to our conversation, Sergio Palleroni. I'm glad you're here with us in the Thomas Mann House, coming from Portland, where you work as an architect and professor at Portland State University. Yeah. I think there might be a difference between this generous living room and in the Thomas Mann House and surrounded by this lush garden and the actual issue in terms of architecture we want to talk about now, which is the changing role of architects and the potential of public interest design. And you have worked in the field of public interest design since the 80s, and you have worked with marginalized communities around the globe. How would you describe your role as an architect?
I go back to your statement about how, this is an extraordinary house, the Thomas Mann House, but I think everything that goes into making the Thomas Mann House, that, the visual delight, a pleasurable environment, a place people feel realized. All those things are things I strive to do in our architecture, or I train students to do. I think it's just, for too long, there's been people who had those benefits, and most people didn't. And so I think in a way, public interest design is just an effort to kind of level the field and make sure that everybody gets the benefits of good design, the great benefits of a place that's delightful and healthy and helps you realize your goals in life. So I think that's kind of been at the margin. And it was, interestingly, I was going to add that when I lived here in LA, in Russet Canyon, I had a friend had gone to school with me at MIT, and he was living in the Schindler apartments, which were tiny little apartments which Schindler built with the idea of economy, and they were just as beautiful as this house, but only 400 square feet. So it's possible to do great things. And I think architects, we only deal with maybe 1-2% of the population. So what happens to the other 99?
That's a good question. Comes to my next idea or thinking of that. I think we all agree that the role of planners and architects in these days is under pressure due to the certain crisis of lack of public, of affordable housing, climate change, migration movements. And it's actually challenged the traditional way architects being designers of objects. This is maybe only one vision or one perspective on it. So once more, when you're working in public interest design, what is your role? How do you see yourself being an architect?
Yeah, it's a good question because I think my role, I hope, will be different than the next generation that will follow, like people like yourself. In a way, I see myself like being an advocate for change. And my advocate for, kind of that the world is facing a lot of crisis. And your colleague was mentioning, 42% of all the kind of investment and impact of environmental impact comes from building. And we're just becoming aware and, trying to deal with that. I think architecture has really and planners are really at the heart of the future, right? I mean, we really need to embrace that we need to kind of take arms and rethink the way we do the future, because it's really, I think it's, we're in a moment of crisis and we're kind of still have our heads in the ground, not paying attention to things, doing things the traditional way, and not really realizing that if we don't do something soon, we may lose what we have and treasure in this world. And my goal really is to bring everybody into that discussion, not just the 1% who has benefit from architecture, but everybody should be part of that. The checker at your grocery store, the person who cleans the house, everybody should be part of that discussion, because we're all going to be impacted by it.
I observe that many would agree on that there has to be more social conscious of the things we do. Mm-hmm. Nevertheless, I observe, coming back to the architecture world, there are many architects that say, okay, this is necessary, but we still have to, this is social work, and this is nothing that moves architecture forward. Yeah. So how would you see that point? Why does it move architecture forward? Your approach? Yeah,
it's a really good question. I think I'm trying to solve it. I mean, a lot of us are trying to solve it. I think I think that I see the work that we do with communities that traditionally wouldn't be served by architecture as producing great architecture. I think it's started out with people just being overwhelmed by the project and trying to do what the possible. But now, if you look around the field, if you look at mass design, if you look at Studio Tam out of Venice, some of the most extraordinary architecture, visually, aesthetically, responsively, everything that's coming out in the world, is in the field of public interest design. It's poetic, beautiful, and it's addressing the needs of people who never would have imagined that they had an architect involved. And those firms, to tell you the truth, and I know most of those, I think they would never do traditional architecture, but there would be nothing gained by going back to architecture, either aesthetically or, in terms of their impact or the satisfaction that they have going back home every day and knowing that they're working towards a future that we can all survive and make the world better,
There is a colleague of yours, the Californian architect Teddy Cruz, who has, I want to quote one of his words, that he is talking about beauty. He says, architects have become decorators and architecture has become a camouflage instrument of economic power.
Yes.
Do you agree on that?
You know, you cannot disagree with Teddy. You know, he puts it out there at the margin, and I think he's totally right in so many ways. I think that, I would agree in most ways that most architecture firms are really kind of have got themselves caught in something that they, speaking behind the scenes to them, they feel trapped in, which is almost like fashion. Every year you have to come up with something new to keep the attention of media and keep attention of people who have the money, who expect new things every year. And yet, why are we caught ourselves in addressing the needs of the people who might want to change it every year? I think we should be educating those people to the key issues and changing their perspective as we begin to address the needs of everybody. We need to change the game. We need to curate a different process. And so I think the role of the architect, as I see it, and I'm borrowing actually Teddy Cruz's word, is one of curating the future, of not just taking the commission and being trapped in whatever people determine you should be doing, but reframing the problem so that it addresses the fundamental issues that we're facing.
Let's talk a little bit more deeper into what actually public design interest, how it is defined. I think in the US and elsewhere in the world, there are a great number of planning offices that already follow, as you mentioned, the Rural Studio as well, and universities and institutions. To my understanding, the term public interest design origins in the US because it's not that known in Germany and maybe not even in Europe. And it is something that addresses social problems, especially in the underserved, unavailable, inaccessible situations. And therefore, it expands the practice of architecture.
Yeah.
So how would you define this term, public interest design? And there are, let me add that on, there are other explanations as well. There's also social impact design. There are all these words that try to explain something that is going on.
I think, you know, I've been asked this question a lot of times, and I'm not sure I'll ever get it right. But we struggled, in the field, we struggled to determine what we should call ourselves. And for a while, we kept trying on different hats. You know, did this represent what we really are about? And I don't think there was totally consensus about public interest design, mainly because it's really, the real focus is that it's about impacting, is to reframe it in terms of how do we make architecture that makes us aware of the things when we build, it's a finite resource, and that it belongs to everybody, and that we should all benefit to the maximum from its impact. And how do we keep that kind of larger perspective that we have a responsibility not just to the client, but to everybody else who's been denied that resource when we build our buildings. And so I think a good public interest designer thinks about those dollars and thinks, okay, for every dollar, I could have $10 of impact on this community. Just if I have a house that all of a sudden respects the neighbor and creates a garden, or in an aggregate with other houses there, produces something the community couldn't otherwise have if we all aggregate our resources. We've been working on this misconception that the world's endless. And right now we're beginning to come into an environmental crisis like here in California, where everything we do is having an immediate environmental crisis, and result. And so I think we as architects need to be aware of that kind of global impact. And the practice we do should be, kind of cognizant of that, but also empowered by the ability to think more broadly. So I think of the public interest designer now as somebody who thinks beyond the immediate mandate that you're given in the commission, and then reframes it in terms of the public good, in terms of the impact it could have to communities. So you might turn back and say, well, hey, when we build this house, maybe we should do this. Or maybe we source the material from a local production here. It could benefit somebody else in your community, who's producing that. And I think that those are simple questions, but they have a huge impact. I've been quoted now too much as saying that 90% of the impact of public interest design is not in the building. but it's in all the ways it affects neighbors, people, supplies, environmental issues, everybody who's part of that community.
That's interesting that you're saying that, and I think this brings us to the actual process. How is it done? There is a quote I found. You said once, "We are the greatest part of the problem, but we have incredible knowledge, and we are the ones that can solve it."
Yeah.
And how do you actually solve the problems? How do you start once you come to a community? Maybe they don't even know what they need. Right. They don't come up to you saying, we need a school, we need the health department.
Right. Yeah, it's actually, I love it, but you have to be patient. It involves a long conversation. Something that architects, the first thing I train architects, and when you were a student, I just sent you out to the community to talk to them about their problem. They might come to you and say, we need a school. And then you say, well, let's start a conversation. Tell me about your need for the school. And you might end up in a kind of conversation that at the end might lead you to build a clinic and an education program. So part of it might be bricks and mortar, and part of it might be a social program that are the outcome of what initially was thought to be the need for a school. So I think that the conversation, the exchanges that architects have been so limited by the constraints of all the publicity and everything that has driven the market of architecture right now has limited us to ask only a few questions and limit the number of interactions we have with our clients, communities. If all of a sudden you find yourself having a longer conversation, understanding the life of the people that you're living, it just fundamentally changes the project. Even if, at the end you do build the school, that school is not going to be the same school that you might have pulled off a shelf from a past experience. It'll be a school that is totally embedded and reflects the community and its needs.
Can you say, maybe you say you have to be patient, you have long conversations, and you also say that the building is not the actual main impact of it. Yeah. If you have maybe one project you can explain that you worked on somewhere in the world, how long did you have discussions? Who did you get involved with? And because this is a public interest design is something you're not planning for the people, you're planning with them. Right. So this how you have an example that it makes it more
right. So I guess in my effort to teach students communication and to reflect on community, I started out by and you were one of my students there, taking basically Americans and Europeans out of their comfort zone and putting them in Mexico as my laboratory, and away from your normal practices, your everyday routines. You might wash your shoes, everything like that, or might wash your clothes, or where you eat, or how you eat, and all those things. I found this students were more open to communication, and so I think that what I did there is just to get students interested in kind of like understanding, beginning to really listen well. And over time, I started a program in the United States that took that reflection, and the program that I think of right now is American Indian housing. So we took the practices we learned about listening, about communication, about how do we communicate with a client, like even the simple conversation. How do you have the conversation? How do you have a conversation about something as complex as a building, which is drawn in very complex things that takes students 5 years to figure out how to make these drawings? And how do you have that conversation with somebody who might have a third grade education, but is very smart, but lives in a squatter community in Mexico? Well, you have to kind of make models. Sometimes you have to make a mock-up of the full size. Sometimes you have to create an image full scale where people can walk through and say, oh yeah, that's what it's going to look like. And so we came up with other modes of communication that were not exclusionary, but would allow people to be part of the conversation and weigh in. By asking, having the conversation go back to, what were the benefits, assets and benefits of the building, and figuring out, well, if we build it this way, it's built out of a material that they are able to repair and continue to repair over time, not some material that gets to Europe and when moment it breaks down, they can't repair it. So those fundamental discussions allow you to make the building, kind of the place ennobling and built of the best practice of play allows you to kind of spotlight what's good about the culture and to build that capacity within the community. So when you leave the community, greater, and I'm going to just quickly give an example of in indigenous work. When we started working with American Indians, we were asked to create housing programs for Native Americans, First Nations, and they were in the area that they gave us was in the central part of the United States, very isolated, beautiful but isolated landscape. And the typical Native American in the United States receives a house, which is usually a prefabricated house that's been built for military use in maybe Florida. It arrives in Montana, a place that is maybe 60 degrees colder in winter. And every year we get dozens of people dying in these places. So we had to come up with a program, housing, that it had to change the system from people just receiving the housing, and having no idea or control of the housing, to a housing type which ended up being straw bale, which was made from local materials, wheat straw, which taught Native Americans how to build their own homes for the first time again after 100 years of colonization, and created the housing mechanisms by which they could distribute it and make sure it was equitably distributed to all the people, and then taught them the financial mechanism, trained them and had discussions to come up with the financial mechanisms by which they could figure out how to buy it within their economic means and not be forever in debt. So change both the economics of it, the delivery of it, and how it became a solution that was environmentally and locally sourced. But it changed the logic some years later, we had an emergency in one of the First Nations, the Cheyenne. They had a massive fire go through, and in 2 days it burnt 250,000 acres. But they reached out to us and they said, you helped us rethink our need. Can you come back and help us become more resilient, rethink how we make decisions and other more fundamental decisions? So that's an example, of what happens in public design. You build lifelong relationships that connect you to these communities and make your journeys kind of connected from then on. I'm now 26 years into working with them. We worked in Mexico for 20-some years. Those relationships were long-standing, built on trust and understanding that the benefits of what we were doing were widespread and everybody was benefiting from that. So that to me is what public design did, and it's about rethinking the system, not taking things as they are assumed, but going back to the assets and qualities and needs and skills of the community and saying, where are the possibilities for change?
That brings us to the question I was going to ask you. You already answered it in a way. Working in public interest design usually causes also the question of how do you measure success? You don't have a finished building that is photographed and nice looking, going to the media, everyone likes it, comes to visit, and so on and so on. So do you go back, that's what you said, you go back and readjust? Do you monitor in one way, or do you do surveys afterwards? Yeah. What is for you a successful public interest design project?
Oh man, that's one we're struggling with. I think this is a really good question, because right now we're having a heyday right now where a lot of interest, we've been very, very busy, right? Insanely busy. And we're just trying to figure out how to keep up with all the demand for the things we're trying to do. And we don't want to just address it. We want to set up a mechanism that as firms across the state, across the whole Northwest, which is the area we work in mainly, across the Northwest United States, as those firms we're having professional firms take on this work increasingly. We have a whole body of firms, even some of the leading firms in the area take it on. We're trying to figure out a mechanism by which they can evaluate the impact of their work. That's the thing that keeps coming back from cities and the firms and the communities. Okay, we are now investing in this. How do you tell us whether it works? The best thing we have is, how are the communities doing after this is done? So some years ago, a group of us created something called the SEED metric, socioeconomic environmental design metric. And it's based on the idea that at the beginning of the project, we sit down with the community and we write a social contract. The architect and the community write a social contract. All the stakeholders sit down and decide. They have a discussion. He says, what do we want the outcome of this building to be? What are the impact we want in the community? Who do we want involved? And what do we want in programming? And we write this document. It's messy and takes a lot of discussion and things like that. At the end, we have we have some food and celebrate that we've written this contract. And then at the end of the project, we go back and it says, did we do what we set out to do? So we do an evaluation of our contract. And then more recently, we've been going back again and looking at the long-term impacts on these communities, and looking at more specifically, like what were the environmental impacts, what were the social impacts in particular, how did it affect planning in the community, other projects in the community. So I think that's something we're trying to wrap our heads around. And this has been our most concrete movement forward, but within even if I go back to how I taught the education, after you graduated, we started doing a process by which we would have the next generation of students go down and evaluate the last project that was built, talk to the community, and say what worked, what didn't work, and that from how the architecture worked, to how did the interactions with the students work, to how the interactions with the community worked. And then we spent a week rethinking the process so that we could learn from what happened before. And I think that was really powerful. And then the last step we took is in the work with the Native Americans in the United States, we did something which we did, rather than saying design build, we did build design, so that we would build the building of the last group of students. So a group of students would go out and build a project that was designed by previous students and design the next project and hand it off to the next group. And by doing that, we did something fundamental, which is that we tested whether the designs of some people could be, of somebody else, could be communicated to the next community. Did all the process communicate, not just to ourselves who are internal to the process, but to the general audience? This is the testing of whether something can be amplified, which is the challenge of public interest design. Can we make it system-wide, right? Can we make it, a practice that affects general change, which we need it to do?
That's actually an argument you probably hear quite often, that the things public interest designers do with students and universities are seen as some kind of drop in the ocean, like small scale things that are not coming into bigger scale. Do you think, in what sense is that scalable? You said it in a way.
You're right.
Is that small things you try out and then it needs those certain jump onto the bigger thing? Right. Have you talked about this? How that could work?
Yeah. We talk about it all the time, and I think that it's one place that unexpectedly we've had a big impact is with actually governments in the region, and the impact has been that a lot of cities and governments, all the way, we're working with governments from San Jose to Seattle, Portland, the whole Northwest region, Alaska, Colorado now. And the thing that governments are coming back to us and saying is, we have limited dollars, and how do we have the most impact for those limited dollars? We know we can't just say this dollar will go to building a building when we also have social needs and all these other needs. So they're becoming increasingly aware that every dollar needs to serve multiple purposes, not just hard costs of the building. Building a nice building like this, you don't get the Thomas Mann program. You have to fund the scholars, you have to do all these things. You have to think of the soft cost, the human cost, and the generational cost of maintaining that and how it will become part of a system. So I think that the best example we've had of this thing of scaling up is recently is in housing. Like America is in a housing crisis, right? We don't have public housing sector, and we, the generation since President Reagan, we don't invest in housing per se. And so we've been working with a complex new entities, which include developers and cities and tax funding. And these public-private initiatives have depended on us to go into a community and to program with the community, have that conversation, that exchange with the community, and figure out what the needs and assets of the community, the kind of needs and assets we would have never taken stock in, what capacities, when things are in the community that could be brought into the project to make it possible. And we bring that and we create a programming document that it's called an asset-based community development platform, which then becomes the framework by which the design and the funding and everything goes into. And you think, okay, this is complicated, but we have done 11 in 3 years now. And this has affected, thousands of families. And it's become so successful that it's one way in which it could only be done through a public interest design process, where all of a sudden the communities that are going to be impacted, and I have to take a side step here. We never talk to the poor. The poor feel always left out of the political process. And in all of this, we've gone to the communities who are going to be housed, who are often at 30% minimum family income. We've asked them, what do you need? What are housing? How does your family live? What are your relations in your family? What services do you need in the community? And then we've gone out to the community and said, who's offering these services? Who could benefit if we built some of those services into the community? Like the community doesn't have a community center, doesn't have a public garden, whatever it is. And we can build those assets in. And as a result, when the community arrives, the building's built and the community arrives, what we have is now the entire community has benefited, not just the resident community, but also it has had, it's now this community is part of the larger community because they've been in conversation with each other. They don't arrive just like foreigners into this community. So that's been an area where I see public interest design scaling up hugely. It's all of a sudden the largest scale of building we often do in communities, but public interest design is making it possible to do the scale.
The way how you explain your work sounds like you are more an agent of political processes, an agent for communities to get through or to to empower communities to get through a political process rather than designing something.
Yeah.
And that maybe let's talk a little bit more about the education, the role of education, architecture education in that term. And you mentioned it several times. 25 years ago, when you started the program in Mexico to get students out of their comfort zone to design, build in a community, in a squatter settlement. I was part of it, and I must say it fundamentally changed my perspective on what architecture can do.
Right.
And nevertheless, I observe that architecture education is still focused on how to build single buildings, how to design self-entities.
Right.
Do you think that there is the architecture education is ignoring the complexity?
Yeah. Good question.
Of social political dynamics as we observe all over the world.
Well,
you have been a teacher for 30 years. So.
I know. I think that, yes. I mean, if you'd asked me this, I started doing this when I was, 30 some years ago. I was radically, yes, they're missing the point. They are not, they're designing for something that's not real. They're not even, it could be in another planet as far as having any relevance to social or to what the needs of a community are. So I was very kind of angry about this. But I realized that, and since then, I went into education. I started from outside education, reevaluating my own education. Then I went into education and thought, the only way I'm going to change this is to go into the education system. So first I did is just create a design build program that immersed students into this field. And I told the university, listen, in that semester I have them, I'm going to teach them everything. I'm going to teach them the cultural studies, I'm going to teach them the construction management, and I'm going to teach them engineering, and I'm going to teach them this. And they're all going to be focused on how each of these things that you're traditionally taught in school could address social needs. So engineering was not like how fancy a concrete system based on some great engineer's perspective, but how would that be built in a way that the community would understand it? And from product materials and things like that. Still learning the science, the hardcore science, but now applying it to the need, to actual need of communities they couldn't afford in the more complex systems. So and it's a much more challenging problem than having all the money, having little money. So I think that re-engineering, rethinking of how each of the courses are fundamental to architecture that I could do in the bubble of Mexico. In the last 25, 30 years, I've brought it back into the academy and started to kind of embed those within the schools. And I'm not alone. When I started, we were like the number 3 or 4 design build program in the United States. And I think that now there's 150 design build programs. And a lot of those programs we've met. There's a network. And a lot of those programs are going through something that maybe we're pioneering, but everybody's building and adding to and doing more brilliantly at times, which is to rethink their entire curriculum in support of this. And it's been incredible. And it's been driven because we took a survey of students across the country some years ago, Brian Bell did, and it found that over 70% of all the students wanted to do public interest design, whether they were at Harvard or they were Portland State or wherever. And the uptake and the interest of students to these issues has driven this to the point that we're having deep discussions with departments across the country, rethinking curriculum of what is history? What is the relevant history we teach? What are the social practices? What is professional practice course if all of a sudden you're serving public needs? All those things are being put in question.
You conducted also design build programs that you were doing with universities and students from other cultures all over the world. Maybe you can share a little bit of this, what you got out of this, what you observed when you made students from, let's say, Japan working with German students, with students from the US. What is the outcome of this getting together?
Yeah, I feel like it's been one of my best parts. I mean, not meeting you and other students there, but I think that both myself and my students have been transformed, my American students have been transformed by the contact with other cultures. And I started out by thinking that architecture didn't have all the skill sets and we could learn from other professions. So I started reaching out to other professionals, like Delft in the Netherlands, or, our Leuven University and Catholic University were very good in social practices, or Tokyo University for emergency planning and construction. And I said, we're dealing with this project, and this time we're going to be collaborating with Tokyo University because they're really good at emergency planning. And they were challenged in themselves to come in and work with us, which had a social impact. So each of us learned something from the relationship. And I think that, for instance, we just finished a project in Munich with Professor Ursula Hartig and Akiko Kabe in Tokyo University, who was director of the program at Tokyo University. And Akiko took on the planning process of getting this city to begin to think about, it had gone through an earthquake and it had to be rebuilt, and we had to fundamentally help the community rethink how it's going to, what would a better city look like? And we planned it based on these observations. And then with Ursula, we came in, and Ursula is a master at building on site with the community. And we had to, and I...
She is the professor of the German...
German University.
German University,
And she and I then collaborated and tried to think, okay, well, you can plan something for a community, but to motivate them to build this, you have to show them what it's going to look like. So we decided to build the cultural center for this town, which was a proof of concept. Is it what it's going to look like? The collaboration brought engineers, it brought social scientists, it brought all these people together. And all this interdisciplinarity is the kind of complexity reflects what I think is what the architecture of the future should look like. That we are reaching out to colleagues in the social sciences, that we are reaching out to people in all the other disciplines and to communities and bringing them into our teams to address the problems. Because no matter how much training I give architects, they can't do it on their own. We need to become interdisciplinary. We need to become multi-stakeholders. We need to become communities solving communities' problems. So we have to in ourselves say, we believe in community building, in their community project, and our team reflects community in itself. So I think that's actually, I think that's where public and design is so powerful, is that the range of experiences and knowledge we bring together to the problem and how fundamental our decisions are and solutions.
That maybe brings us to the last and very important question as well, the question of communication. We've talked about the scale, we've talked about the measuring of success, and you telling about all this knowledge that you collect as well. You don't give away, but you collect as well. And as this way of working is so complex, it makes it also very complex to communicate. And it doesn't. There is no such pattern. As there is no such pattern, you work along as an architect, getting a project done. There is also no manual how classic media can follow up on that in terms of images, drawings, and figures. And then it's done out in the media, and then there is a success, and it's known all over. So my question is, how do you communicate those complex processes?
Well, you know, I maybe I have two parts to that. Really, it needs like 20 answers. The communication is actually, you know, that challenge has brought us to create an organization we call Design for the Common Good, which is bringing all these networks of people across the globe who are working on this problem, and we are coming together to kind of to share the experiences. So like, I can only bring so many people to a team, but imagine if you were wired to I think right now 37,000 some groups across the world that we know of who are working on this. So imagine if you could talk to them all and bring them in, and like Batman, send a bat signal out and say, we need help, and we need help with this. And somebody at the other end would, you know, call you, and you'd have a conversation with somebody who had experience in doing this. So I think communication to us is two parts. One is the conversation, which is sincere, which is honest, which gets at the fundamental issues, which asks questions from communities and from stakeholders about their needs, and is continued through and respected, and is reflected in the final building, and everybody feels like we all heard each other. And the second part at the architect's end is the communication you have with this network of people out there who help you make the most of your project and bring this expertise. So the Design for the Common Good is building this platform right now where you can put out a call, like I said, the back signal, and all of a sudden somebody will say, you'll be able to talk to somebody maybe in Malaysia who tackled the same problem. Or you'll look up their design in this database, and you'll call, and you'll reach out to them, and somebody will answer the call and help you through this or add value to what you're doing. And so our hope is based on really our experience that collaboration always leads to better solutions.
So that is, let's say, maybe this kind of oral history or living library idea of communication within the profession. Mm-hmm. But now, as I'm working as an architecture journalist, having the idea of getting the ideas out of the bubble into the world, where we need people to participate in those processes, not only the clients and communities, but everyone, the politicians and everything. And I always wonder how this can work and how you can transport the success by storytelling. Yeah. And I would like to share maybe one observation that gives me hope, looking at the Architecture Biennale in Venice, that has been a seismograph for architecture discussion over the years. And looking at their themes they've been following in recent years, like people meet in architecture, common ground, how will we live together, no matter what Stan in the certain pavilions talked about. But even though these titles show me that there is a shift from the architecture perspective away from the single object, like we celebrated in the 90s, this architecture world, and we have this huge elephant-like buildings in the world, and we would admire them and show them in exhibitions. So there is actually a shift from the single object towards the human being as the most important element in the planning process. And now, hearing that next year's theme is called Africa as a laboratory for the future, to me seems that it goes even one step further, which is actually focusing on the connection between the architecture production, no matter whether it's public interest design or anything, and the global justice. Right. And as well as anti-colonial, anti-racist perspectives. And I think that gives me hope in a way that this is already, as the biennial is very well looked at, and other biennials and triennials are following this, that this is a very important part of that.
Yeah. I think beautiful. I mean, I couldn't have said it better. I think that one of the things that's interesting, I think that I didn't touch upon, is that, when you look back, I mean, and you ask people, I mean, you could have asked Thomas Mann in this house. The house in the end is important, but the journey, the whole story of how he got here, and the house and his choice of architect and the conversations he had, probably no single photograph would have captured that. For him, it was a story, of years of living and changing the gardens, and buildings are living things. We're creating living entities within a community, and what people carry away, like the people who we worked with in Mexico, when I go and ask them, they point, the school has been transformative that we built with you, but it's all the stories of the relationship with you and the people, and how we got to cement, and how we were able to get this and change, and everything that it took to build that, and how it impacted everybody. That's what people remember. They don't remember that one beautiful photograph of the building. So that's I think one of the things that public interest design does, is remind us that these are the important stories that we need to be telling ourselves we're going to have a future.
That's maybe a good final word, as having a plaidoyer for storytelling and discussions like this. Thank you very much for the Thomas Mann House, for us having this discussion here. And thank you for listening.